It's been nearly 6 months since Russia launched its brutal assault on Ukraine. And while the fighting has made it impossible to get an accurate count, most estimates put the Ukrainian death toll in the tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians, including children. The Kremlin is now under investigation for war crimes in the International Criminal Court for its many attacks targeting homes, schools, hospitals, and evacuation routes. And much of the world has rallied around Ukraine with military aid and humanitarian supplies, although officials there say they still need more assistance to beat back Russian troops. But as the battles continue, 2 local doctors are also worried about other devastating health effects, from the spread of disease and malnutrition to worsening pre-existing conditions, PTSD, and other mental health problems. They recently wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, quote, "Health professionals have responsibilities not only to respond to the needs of current victims, but also to engage in preventing the devastating, long-lasting, intergenerational effects of war on human health and life." Dr. Barry Levy is a physician, epidemiologist, and associate professor of public health and community medicine at the Tufts School of Medicine. Dr. Jennifer Leaning is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and senior fellow at the university's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. Thank you both for being here. Dr. Leaning, why is it important for those of us in the public at large to think about this conflict not only in terms of politics and political violence, but in terms of public health?
It's one of the first major intrastate wars, that is a war that's international, that we have really looked closely at for the last 20 years. I mean, it is an astonishing war in the sense of its capacity to kill broadly and to leave long-lasting effects because of the heavy armaments that are used indiscriminately. So when we're thinking about public health, which is the health of populations, this war is creating enormous effects on how people can think about their future, how they can think about the harvest next year, where their children might have to flee to. Their families are now scattered throughout Europe. So you have a disruption of human life and human future that is quite extraordinary, all in a relatively small place to 40 million people.
I want to make sure that I understand this as clearly as I can. Are the effects that you're talking about effects that have existed in other conflicts, but that we haven't had the tools to fully scrutinize and analyze? Or are the effects different here because of the power of the destructive technologies at play, or because of something else involving the nature of Ukraine, the nature of its relationship with Russia, sociocultural issues on top of other issues? Which is it?
It's both.
It's both?
Okay. I mean, excellent question. Part of it is that these explosive effects of war, that is the kinetic effects of the use of bombs and killing people and forcing them to flee, is a feature of all wars. But it's particularly intense in a relatively small area. It's rather one-sided in terms of Russia has command of the air. And what you have is a war of attrition where the Ukrainians are trying to hold on, outmatched in terms of population and in terms of armaments by a country that is much more populated and also more sophisticated in the use of weapons. And what we're seeing is the war entirely on the countryside of Ukraine. Russia is lobbing things or aiming things into the country. So it's a punishing war where, strangely enough, it's at a close standstill because of the very, very effective response of the Ukrainian government and military.
Let me get Dr. Levy in here. You two mentioned in your New England Journal piece that it's difficult to say exactly how many people have died, how many people have been injured. I tend to think of wars as having easily tabulated morbidity and mortality counts. I guess I'll ask another version of the question that I just posed to Dr. Leaning. Is there something about this conflict that makes it especially hard to get a handle on the human toll? Or have we pretended to have clarity in previous conflicts when maybe we didn't?
Yeah, I would agree with what Jennifer said so far, and I would say that the same kinds of issues that are operating in many other wars. There's about 40 other wars going on in the world, but this one is up front and 24/7 news coverage, and so we're seeing on a bigger scale a lot of what has gone on in mainly intrastate wars, mainly civil wars in mainly low and middle income countries for many years. So it's and some of these same issues with regard to trying to quantitate how many deaths, how many serious injuries, those are things that operate in almost all conflicts. The data systems are down, there's the fog of war. Each side has reason not to accurately report either military or civilian casualties. And importantly, many of the deaths and injuries to civilians occur not only due to bombs and bullets, but in fact, probably on a much larger scale, more people dying and becoming ill and seriously injured as a result of destruction of the infrastructure. We're talking about food and water systems, healthcare facilities, and so forth, as well as displacement. So those indirect effects of war causing people to be displaced. There's about 12 million people displaced from Ukraine, roughly half, a little more than half within the country, a little less than half outside the country, 12 million altogether. That plus the targeting of civilian infrastructure is really causing a lot of the casualties that may never be quantified.
Including healthcare infrastructure, just to highlight that, right? That's
yes, and there's been already there've been recorded almost 500 attacks, targeted attacks on hospitals and clinics. Many healthcare workers have been killed or injured. Many patients have been killed and injured. And equally importantly, there's no longer the healthcare there to provide, ongoingly to the local population. So it's a horrendous problem, and it's a war crime.
Dr. Leaning, I hope you can get just a little bit more granular when we talk about the consequences of care not being provided, what that might mean in practice. I think of Ukraine as a country that has a pretty substantial HIV infection rate, for example. My assumption would be that people who are living with HIV in Ukraine may have trouble getting the treatment that keeps them healthy, keeps them alive. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but can you expand a little bit on what Dr. Levy just said?
Well, let's talk about the direct war wounds, the direct war injuries first, okay? Because Ukraine is a quite sophisticated country, which again is different from some of the other places where we have seen wars taking place. And the destruction of hospitals, maternity wards, and operating rooms has meant that the treatment of these severe war casualties has been markedly impaired. So people are dying of wounds who, even in Ukraine, in ordinary times, would have really survived if it wasn't happening in such wide area and extent, and if the facilities hadn't been destroyed. So one thing is that the war injuries are not being treated in ways that result from the intensity of this war. The second is that you have a lot of people who are unable to get access to good food or good water. And this is something Barry may want to expand upon, but there's an increase in the indirect effects of war on these major health issues. And the third thing before I leave is that there is no place to hide, in Ukraine, because this is in a fishbowl. Russia has commanded the air. It has excellent, satellite capacities, good drone capacities. It knows where people are, and it is just choosing where it wants to lob a major explosive device. So this is the fishbowl aspect of it, is that you are caught, and this sense of being trapped and always in jeopardy is a very, very burdensome aspect of this war.
Actually, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but Barry, you might want to expand upon the indirect effects, if you wouldn't.
Yeah, do you want to take a crack at that, Dr. Levy?
Sure. So what we're talking about is, for example, communicable diseases, because of the fact that many people are not drinking safe water. Water treatment plants and pipelines so forth have been destroyed. People are getting gastrointestinal and diarrheal diseases. Children are dying as a result. respiratory diseases, including COVID, because people are closely crowded together in, in subways and refugee camps and so forth. Tuberculosis, which was already of a high prevalence in Ukraine, is likely spreading more frequently. There's more malnutrition. People who have chronic diseases, heart and lung disease, diabetes, are not able to get their regular medications. Women are not able to get good prenatal care or care during labor and delivery, and newborns are not getting adequate care. And indeed, the mental health problems are profound, arguably the most prevalent set of problems that are occurring. So there are all these are arguably indirect effects, and not deaths or injuries due to bombs and bullets, but they're equally as important, if not occurring even more frequently than the bombs and bullet injuries.
Dr. Leaning, I want to give you the last question here, and you've only got about 30 seconds. It's a big question, but you two call in your piece for proactive approach on the part of physicians to get a handle on the long-term effects. What would that mean in practice?
We actually say that physicians need to pay, and nurses and other healthcare personnel need to pay attention to the enormous reconstruction needs and current needs that are going on in Ukraine as long as this war continues and for decades thereafter. And so we should be prepared to be part of the entry teams there to help provide healthcare on the borders and in the country, many of the refugees. And we also need to be aware of the enormous need that will come out of this country seeking our help when the war begins to die down.
I apologize for interrupting. We are out of time. Dr. Jennifer Leaning and Dr. Barry Levy, thank you both.
Great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.